Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. I'm Ted Hewitt, President of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC as we call it for short. I'd like to acknowledge that SSHRC's offices are situated on the traditional, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As we are meeting in a virtual environment and from various locations, we also acknowledge from coast to coast to coast the ancestral and traditional territory of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who call this land home. I'm very pleased on behalf of SSHRC to present this next event in our public talk series in conversation with, which we offer in partnership with the Conversation Canada.
We fund research in the social sciences field. The researchers, students that supports them helps to better understand the human behavior, culture, and the way society works. The work specialists in social sciences were never as essential to face the challenges society is facing right now and to capture new opportunities in the recovery after the pandemics, the climate change, the environment, or the reconciliation with Aboriginal nations.
We are delighted to partner with the Conversation Canada to bring the perspectives of some of Canada's best and brightest scholars to the public. These talks provide a unique forum where we can hear directly from academics who have important views based on scientific research to share. Their research can enrich our understanding of people and world affairs. Today, our noted guest is Semra Sevi. Dr. Sevi is a Banting Postdoctoral Fellow at Columbia University and a visiting scholar at McGill University with the Institute for the Study of Canada. In July 2023, she will join the faculty at the University of Toronto as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. Her research focuses on gender and politics, representation, voting behavior, and partisanship in young voters and immigrants. In working on her PhD dissertation, What Voters Want, Identifying Voter Preferences for Candidates, she created an original database to collect and analyze Canadian historical candidate data at the federal and Ontario provincial levels. Stretching back to 1867, Dr. Sevi's resulting database is the largest collection of data of its kind. Excuse me. Semra Sevi a obtenu son doctorat en sciences politiques de l'Université de Montréal en 2021, mais elle a déjà publié une vingtaine d'articles dans des revues à comité de lecture, a consigné un chapitre dans un ouvrage collectif et a rédigé un rapport de recherche pour Élections Canada. Ses publications et ses données sur la représentation démocratique, notamment sur la façon dont l'électorat évalue les candidats et candidates, sont cités très souvent. Le CRSH a décerné son prix Talon à cette chercheur émergent, exceptionnel et prolifique en raison du rayonnement et de l'influence de ses travaux sur la chose publique. Dr. Sevi is joined today by Lisa Varano, Deputy Editor at the Conversation Canada. Lisa holds a master's in journalism from Western University and was with CTV News Toronto prior to joining the Conversation Canada. So thank you again to everyone for joining the conversation. Je vous remercie encore une fois d'être des nôtres. And now I will hand things over to Lisa and Dr. Sevi.
Thank you for the introduction, Ted, and welcome everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that closed captioning and simultaneous translation are available for this event. If you'd like the closed captioning, click on the link below the video screen. And for simultaneous interpretation, click on the globe language icon in the top right of the screen. Today's interview will be followed by a Q&A. Please submit your questions at any time in English or in French using the Ask a Question function, which is in the top right of the platform. Now for a conversation with Semra. Hi, Semra.
Hi, Lisa.
Thanks for joining us. You've called this event Women in Politics, to run or not to run. And that's also the topic or the headline of the story that you wrote for theconversation.com, currently on our homepage. So I'd like to start with a quote from your article. You write, "Despite the progress towards gender equality, women's representation in Canadian politics continues to fall short. With only 30% of seats in the House of Commons held by women, there's still a long way to go for Parliament to capture the diversity of the population it represents." So to begin, how has women's representation in Canadian politics changed over time?
Okay, great. Thanks for the question. To answer that, I'm going to show you a graph, so maybe the tech people can help us here. So I'm going to show you the percentage of women in the population among candidates and MPs since 1921. So the x-axis here indicates the year of each federal election from 1921 to the most recent election in 2021. And the y-axis is the percentage of women in each of the three categories. So what we see here is that women make up about 50% of the population. And the black line here on this graph indicates that the percentage of women in the population in each of those years. So if we press next, we will see the percentage of candidates increasing over time. And that's what this light pink line shows. So in 1921, there were 5 women candidates, and by 2021, we have a record number of just over 760 women candidates. And if we press next one more time, now we'll see the percentage of women who are elected. So this line here looks largely parallel to the line that we saw previously to candidates. So it's a first indication to suggest that when women run, they do win. So in summary, what this figure shows us is that the share of women in the House of Commons has increased over time, but it's still well below the share of women in the Canadian population. Even with the recent wins by women candidates in the 2021 election, there's still a long way for us to go before they're fully represented.
And how does the percentage of women MPs compare among the different political parties?
Okay, so I'll show you one more figure. So if we can press next again. Great. So here we see the percentage of women MPs for the 5 big parties that we have in Canada. And we see that the percentage of women MPs is actually increasing for all of the parties, with the NDP leading in the top 3 major parties.
In your article on theconversation.com, you described the factors that contribute to the gender gap for women in politics. And you discussed 3 main obstacles for women in politics according to the research. What are those 3 main obstacles?
So on this topic in general, the literature provides different explanations, and overall, it suggests that the underrepresentation of women come from multiple obstacles of the political process. And of these explanations, 3 have gained the most traction, which is why I focus on those. So the first is that voters might have a gender bias. So this is the idea that for various reasons, voters might prefer to be represented by a man compared to a woman. The second idea is that women may simply not be interested to run as candidates. And this could be for a multitude of reasons. It could be because they have competing duties like family or childcare, but it could also be that they simply lack self-confidence. So the third explanation is that even if women are willing to run, the next obstacle that they have to face is that parties tend to choose men over women. So women are less likely to be recruited to run for office in the first place. They're less likely to receive the suggestion to run from party officials, leaders, but also their family and friends. In fact, the existing research here shows that when you're recruited to run for office, regardless if you're a man or a woman, you're more likely to emerge as a candidate. So this is what I'm looking at in my present work.
And in your research, you've spent several years now gathering data and conducting experiments to examine these 3 theories that we just talked about. What are your most interesting findings?
So I've examined the question about women in politics for several years now, and I find that women used to receive fewer votes, but this is no longer the case in recent elections. Today, voters are not biased against women candidates. This is true at both the federal level, and it's also true at the Ontario provincial elections. It's true when we look at first entry into politics, but it's also true when we look at incumbent women, for example. I also looked at whether women are more risk averse to elections with campaigns than men. I've recently conducted a laboratory online experiment with my PhD advisor, Andre Blais, and we find that women are just as likely as men to be candidates in elections with campaigns. So we don't find any evidence to suggest that women are shying away from elections, whereas men are embracing it. On the contrary, we find that women are just as likely to compete in an election than men are.
So in other words, it seems like there is no voter bias against female candidates today, but there is still party bias against female candidates. What can be done to convince these political parties that the public will elect female candidates?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a widespread misconceptions about women performing poorly at the ballot box. And this could be part of the reason why parties prefer to encourage men to run rather than women, for example. We need to show them that that's simply not the case. I recently read a paper in PANAS, for example, that conducted various experiments during the recent Democratic primary in the United States. They gave half of the participants information on the latest scholarly work that shows that when women run, they do just as well as men, and half of the other half of the participants didn't receive this information. And what they find is that the participants that were given this information were more likely to say that they would vote for a woman candidate. So perhaps that's what we need to do. We need to show parties that at the aggregate level, women do just as well as their men counterparts. But we should also keep an open mind that there might be other factors that are biasing the selection process. And this is part of the reason why I think we need to study parties more. So as you know, in the Canadian context, for example, the nomination process is not very transparent across different parties and across different levels. We don't always know who are all the candidates in the nomination process. We don't always get to see votes being cast towards them. This is usually done behind back doors. So there might be other factors that contribute into why parties are more likely to encourage men to run than women.
Okay, so let's dig into your data set that Ted mentioned in the introduction. Your SSHRC-funded doctoral dissertation was called What Voters Want, Identifying Voter Preferences for Candidates. And you collected and analyzed candidate data at the federal and Ontario levels, going all the way back to Confederation. And then you published your original data sets on the Harvard University Dataverse. What type of information do your data sets include?
So for the federal data set, I have a total of just over 46,500 candidates and 31 variables. I suppose the most important variable is unique IDs. So I can say a few words about that. Unique IDs, basically, the idea here is that many individuals run multiple times for elections. Even after they win, they run multiple times. If they don't win, they also run multiple times. But whenever names are involved, there's a lot of complexities with data in the sense that people write their name differently. Sometimes they use their maiden name, sometimes they don't. In the case of women who may change their last names after they get married, there's complexities there as well. Individuals over time also sometimes in very recent elections, in fact, some individuals ran multiple times in the same election and used different versions of their name, sometimes just having first initials, sometimes fully writing it down. So whenever names are involved, and this is true for candidate names, but it's also true for ridings, provinces, party names, for example, they're written differently across time and also in the same election as well. So I went through the data set and I assigned unique IDs to every single individual. And then I looked them up several times thereafter to make sure that I'm matching them up to the same unique ID so that we can trace individuals over time. This was something that was not done before. So it's a big contribution to the data set. I've also included variables such as the candidate's gender, their age, whether they switched parties or not, their incumbency status, their occupation. I created an occupation category that matches up their occupation to Census Canada's occupation categories as well. I have party ID, whether the candidate identifies as having Indigenous origin, or if they identify as a member of the LGBTQ2+ community, their vote share, and so on.
How could other identifying factors such as race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, etc., be collected?
So this is a question that I've been thinking about for some time. I think it's important that we have these variables in the data. I think the best approach here is for the Library of Parliament to collect self-reported information on these variables and then share them with the academic community. I'm not convinced with the work that infers race, ethnicity, and religion based on names or photos, for example. That information should be provided by the candidates themselves. A candidate's race or their ethnicity, for example, is not very private information when they run for office. In fact, oftentimes we see candidates use this information in their campaign materials. And in the case of elected MPs, they're usually proud of their background, especially if they could link it up with the voters in their constituency, for example. And parties also have this information, at least at the aggregate level, but they're not willing to share the individual level information with the academic community.
So based on all of your research so far, what do you think can be done to improve women's representation in politics?
Yeah, we just need to encourage more women to run because when they do, they win at equal rates as men. We need to make the job more desirable. Women need to see the policy consequences of their exclusion from office in order to be motivated to seek a seat at the table, for example. We need to make sure that they're not missing from the room when decisions are being made that affect them the most.
How does your data set facilitate research over time? And why is this type of longitudinal research so important?
So usually when we think about candidates, we only observe one or a few elections. So for example, if we want to study how candidate gender affects voters' likelihood of supporting candidates, for example, we're only going to observe this in one or a few elections. Longitudinal assessments have received less attention, but in fact, they're most helpful in clarifying how well the Canadian legislature captures the diversity of the population it seeks to represent. So my data set in this sense builds a bridge in that we get to study these questions over time, something that was not possible to do before. So for example, we could look at how lawyers have fared over time, whether there are consequences for MPs who have switched parties and then ran again under another party label. We can also study progressive ambition. So if we think that minorities or individuals that come from diverse backgrounds are more likely to seek office in elections that go unnoticed and then go for federal elections, this is something that we can now study because of the unique IDs that I talked about earlier.
Okay, let's talk about events that have been in the news in recent years. Back in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau formed Canada's first gender-balanced cabinet. And when he was asked why, he famously said, because it's 2015. Do you think it actually made a difference?
I think so. I think that it's no coincidence that we now have gender-based or gender diverse cabinet in power, and the government is finally making advances on childcare, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and going back a bit further, Canada has only ever had one female prime minister, of course, Kim Campbell in 1993. How long do you think it might be before the next one?
I hope not very long.
Okay. Looking beyond Canada, what countries have the highest percentage of women in elected office, and why might that be?
So my work on women in politics has focused primarily on Canada, but Rwanda, for example, is a country where more than 60% of its politicians are women. New Zealand also made history recently as female politicians became the majority in parliament, outnumbering their male counterparts. In both of these countries, there are quotas in place. So in New Zealand's case, I should clarify that the quotas are voluntary based, adopted by parties, and then in Rwanda, it's legislated. But what we hear in both of these countries oftentimes is that women politicians are less likely to be taken seriously and more likely to be addressed using condescending language. They're often told that they got the position because of their gender and not because of their qualifications, and that more qualified candidates were pushed aside to make room for them.
Based on what you've seen with other countries and quotas, do you think Canada should consider adopting quotas, or perhaps the political parties should consider adopting quotas if they haven't?
So the problem in the Canadian context is not that women are not getting elected. It's that they're not running to begin with. So instead of quotas, what we can do is encourage systematic recruitment efforts, both by political parties and activists. If we get women on the ballot, that's the way to solve women representation. We need to get more women to get into politics. Women who have been recruited know how to effectively recruit other women. So we need to use them more effectively.
Well, we've given an overview of your research and got to know it a bit better. I'd love to get to know you a bit better as well. So tell us a little bit about what initially sparked your interest in studying women in politics.
So back in 2015, you might remember the high-profile MP Eve Adams. She had left the then governing Conservative Party to join the Liberal Party. At the time, I had just completed my master's. Doing a PhD was not on my radar. I had a full-time job, but I was following the news about Eve Adams closely. And she cited the mean-spirited leadership of Stephen Harper as her motive to switch parties, although she had been a card-carrying conservative almost all her life. And all of this might be true, but what interested me most was how voters in the riding and the media were portraying her. And the commentary of her switch actually reminded me of another switch. And this had happened a decade earlier when Glenda Stronach left the Conservatives to join Paul Martin's Liberal cabinet back in 2005. And her defection was an important one for Paul Martin's minority government because he was up for a key budget vote that was coming, and he gave her a cabinet position when she switched parties. When the switch had happened, I recall that MPs did not shy away from accusing her of whoring or prostituting herself for political ambition. So when Eve Adams switched parties, it got me thinking that men have also switched parties over the time in Canadian history. We saw this at the time recently with David Emerson, who joined Stephen Harper's government just about 2 weeks after he had won the election with the Liberal Party. We also saw it with Scott Ryson, who switched from the Progressive Conservatives to the Liberal Party, and Paul Martin then gave him a cabinet position as well. Yet the men that switched parties, I didn't see them being called the types of names that I saw women who switch parties and be called. So I wondered if there were political consequences for changing party affiliation. I wondered if it was gendered and if this has changed over time, especially because we know that in the Canadian context, party loyalty has increased. So this was really more of a curiosity for me than anything else. I wasn't enrolled in a graduate program. I was simply curious and could not find the answers out there in the existing work. So this is how I started collecting all these data. And it's also what led to my interest in studying women in politics. In fact, my first academic publication using all these data looked at the consequences of party switching in the Canadian context at the federal level. And what I found was that switchers today face a much steeper road to re-election compared to switchers in the 19th century, for example. And as for the gender question, the reason why I collected all this data to begin with, well, I went through all of that data collection to realize that party switching actually doesn't happen that often in Canada. And the sample of women switchers is extremely small to draw any real significant inferences from it. So we concluded that paper inviting more women to switch parties for a further study. So I was really happy to see recently that more women did switch parties.
So you've studied the obstacles to women in politics, but you've also faced obstacles in your own life. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the barriers you yourself have overcome in pursuit of your PhD.
Yeah, so doing a PhD is hard. Doing it in your fourth language as a first-generation scholar is just crazy. I can't say I pushed through open doors to get where I am. Like most first-generation scholars, I did not know how to apply to PhD programs. I did not know about the many scholarship opportunities out there. I didn't actually know what a PhD was when I started. Or what my job prospects would be when I would be done. I feel very fortunate to have had a village of mentors and supporters that have helped me along the way.
Who have some of your mentors been?
I've been lucky to have several great mentors. So I simply would not be in academia if it were not for Christopher Cochrane at the University of Toronto. I met him at the end of my master's program. He was never my professor. He did not owe me anything by way of being his student previously. Yet he showed me how to apply, made calls on my behalf, and he pushed me to get out of my comfort zone. I probably wouldn't have ended up at the University of Montreal if it wasn't for him either. And my PhD advisor, Andre Blais, taught me everything I know, from carrying out research to becoming the very best student, researcher, colleague, and teacher that I can be. And at different points, I also received support from James Druckmann at Northwestern University, Donald Green, my postdoc advisor at Columbia, Ruth Desanville, my co-advisor at the University of Montreal, and also my current collaborator, Peter Lowen at the University of Toronto. So I would say that all of these individuals had a great impact in my success.
And it's really amazing that you learned, as you said, your fourth language, French, to study with Andre Blais at the University of Montreal. Like, that is amazing, among your other many accomplishments. So to any first generation students who may be watching, what words of encouragement would you offer them?
I suppose I'd say if I got here, so can you. As cliche as it may sound, I don't believe there's one recipe for success. Everyone has their own journey. It's hard because we're so used to comparing ourselves with our peers. We feel like there's constantly a competition going on. But I think if a year ago you told me that things would work out for me, I would not believe you. So I guess I would say work hard, don't overthink, and be kind. And
you too could potentially be like Semra, winning the Shirk Talent Award. So that's amazing. That's amazing words of encouragement. Going back to the female politicians, I'm wondering which female politicians do you admire personally and why?
So I guess to answer that question, I'd say running for politics is hard. Politicians are held to higher standards than the average individual. Your life is scrutinized at every level. You lose your private life. And if you're a woman, you have to deal with the media coverage being gendered, And if that's not enough, you also expose yourself to getting uncivil messages from random individuals on social media, for example, not to mention the heckling that women have to face in Parliament. So I'd say that I admire all women who put themselves in such a vulnerable position. The job is not a desirable one, but getting the opportunity to set policy is very powerful and meaningful. So the ability to help people to have a better life is worthwhile being a politician, I'd say.
Do you think that potentially you might be interested in running for office yourself one day?
I'm at the starting point of my professional career in academia. So that will be the focus for me for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so speaking about what's next, I know that you're moving here to Toronto soon. Tell us about what is coming up for you in July with joining the University of Toronto, and also what other research projects you have on the horizon.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to start my new position at the University of Toronto in the Department of Politics. So at the moment, I'm working on a project with Peter Lowen on recruitment of women in politics in Canada, particularly. I've read a number of memoirs written by Canadian politicians, both men and women. And what I find in these memoirs is that they reveal that although men believe they were born to lead someday, they were looking to fulfill a lifelong dream, they were more likely to be recruited by multiple sources on multiple occasions to run for office. So, for example, Michael Ignatieff talks about the men in black suits who went to Harvard to convince him to come back and run to be the leader of the Liberal Party and to come save Canada. Trudeau Jr. refers to them as political staffers who took them to a chalet up north in Montreal to convince him to come run for the leader of the Liberal Party and save Canada. So it almost feels like they have the same ghostwriter. It's the same trajectory of the story. But the memoirs written by the women politicians who are similarly qualified as men, and they're equally ambitious, they're lawyers, they're businesswomen, they're more likely to say that they entered politics because of a specific policy concern. And if they were recruited, they were done so by fewer sources and on much fewer occasions. So these anecdotes are important because they inform the type of research questions that we should study. But even if we look at empirical evidence, for example, in Canada, but also in the United States, they consistently reveal that men are considerably more likely to think about running for political office than women are. Even highly qualified women are less likely than men to perceive themselves as qualified to run for political office, for example. So in general, all of this academic work has shown that women are less likely to be encouraged to run for office than men. And this is particularly problematic because potential candidates are significantly more likely to consider running for office if a party source, for example, encourages them to run. So if women face this recruitment disadvantage, it might also impact their political ambition. And in turn, it might hinder their emergence as candidates to run in the future. So my current work on gender and politics is to look at different party recruitment messages and its implications for candidate emergence in Canada.
And is this what you're working on with Andre Blais, or is that another project?
So this is another project, and this is a project that I will be working with Peter Lowen at the University of Toronto.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So we're just about getting to the audience Q&A portion of the event. A reminder that you can ask a question through the platform, and we have received our first question. So I'll just take a look and pass it along to you, Semra. Okay, so this viewer, Britt, asks, hello, one thing I find is that there's still considerable pressure for women in politics and everywhere to be young or young-looking. Women in politics are on average 5 years younger than their male counterparts. In my municipality, the two women are or look young, where the men can gray and age. This unconscious bias of voters contributes to the lack of women running and older women getting elected. Do you see ageism as a contributor? And if so, how can we address that? Thanks, Britt.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So the data that I've looked at with respect to the intersection of women and age, for example, what we find is that women tend to enter politics when they're older, when perhaps because their kids are older and therefore they seem to have more time to spend in politics than men, for example. So they do enter when they're a bit more older, which means they're disadvantaged because they have less time in politics than their counterparts, for example. But it's true that women underestimate their qualifications and if they perceive a gender bias among voters, they would be disencouraged to run. So because of these extra hurdles, what ends up happening is that the most talented and the most ambitious women seek office in the first place.
So in our next question from a viewer, it says, in your research, did you find that women had more challenges with fundraising than men? Based on the responses you may have received, what did you find?
So I don't really look at that question in myself, but the good news in the existing literature is that in my case, women win when they run. But in other work that other scholars have done, they show that they raise similar amounts as men do, for example, and generally speaking, they're also treated very similarly with respect to their experiences in politics.
Okay, so those are the questions we received so far. A reminder, you can ask your question through the platform. So please go ahead and I'll be monitoring to see if any others come in. I think one has just popped up now. So this one says, how do we make politics a safe place for women and for those who identify as women today? There is so much hate directed at politicians, and some of it is very targeted and out of proportion to what others might expect to face.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to make politics reachable by all underrepresented groups, but it's also important to make sure that they have a safe space once they're in politics as well. So the good news here, according to the research that has been done and some of the work that I have currently under review as well, is that men and women have similar experiences in politics. So I don't want to suggest that there are no examples of explicit sexism or discrimination that women face. Of course, there are. But when we look systematically at women's experiences when they enter the political arena, for example, they don't look that much different from men. And this is because of partisanship, for example. In politics, your most salient identity is your political affiliation. So it's not about your gender. What this means is that a card-carrying sexist who hate women, for example, is still going to go out and vote for them if they share the same party label. So in politics, unlike in any other profession, that are dominated by men, say, for example, being a lawyer or engineering or technology, for example, there isn't this layer of partisanship that sort of levels off the playing field that we see in politics.
Just springboarding off that question, I'm wondering, as women's representation in politics improves and we reach the so-called critical mass of women in politics, which I believe is considered to be a third, 33%. Do you think that just by the numbers and having more women in the room, it is making it a safer space with that alone?
Surely having more women will have positive implications for the experience that women will have in politics. So that's something that I agree with, yeah.
So our next viewer question asks, have you learned anything from your data to talk to the notion of, quote, winnable ridings? and if women are more or less likely to be in them?
Yeah, that's an important question. And there is work on this, existing work that looks at whether women are put or used as sacrificial lambs, for example, put in writings that they're likely to lose. And this might be true, and it's probably possible at the individual level in certain writings, but at the aggregate level, when we look at all of the elections, the evidence is very clear, study after study, and mine is no exception to that. It shows that when women run, they win. So there might be high profile cases where they are put into certain ridings where their chances of winning is not that high, but at the aggregate level, they do win.
And we also talked a little bit, Semra and I, previously about this idea of women being brought in as leader at a time when it is to clean up a mess or to deal with a scandal, and then they're kind of pushed out or not brought on as permanent party leader when that's done. So I don't know if Semra, you wanted to speak a little bit about some examples of that we've seen in Canadian politics.
Yeah. So in the Canadian context, what we see is that highly qualified women are considered good enough by their parties, for example, to put things back together, especially when there is a crisis. But they often go unnoticed when we're thinking about a leadership position. So if you can think back in the Canadian example, for example, we see that women are more likely to hold interim leadership roles, but their names often disappear when we think about a permanent leader. And a permanent leader is being discussed. So, for example, Rona Ambrose is a good example of this. Many had credited her for putting the Conservative Party back together and putting it back on track. But when it came time to discuss the permanent leader, her name had all but disappeared on the candidates list.
Okay. We have another question from a viewer. This viewer asks, has your research found any difference between women? Sorry, let me just read this carefully. Okay, has your research found any difference between women, whether they are more or less likely to run for a second term? And if so, is there any evidence that the higher degree of criticism and online vitriol that we receive as women while in office is a factor in this decision?
So when I look at whether incumbent women are more likely to run again compared to incumbent men, for example, I actually find that incumbent women are more likely to run again. So they're just as likely to run again as incumbent men, for example. I don't find much differences there. What is interesting is that women who lose are less likely to run again. So there might be something going on there with that the loss is, they're taking that loss much harder than men are, for example. But those who run get an experience of how the political system works. They get more knowledge of how to run a campaign. So I guess it becomes much more easier for them to run again in a subsequent election. And that's why I don't find any gender differences between men and women who seek office again after being elected.
As we're talking about women who have been elected, I'm wondering, based on what you've read and researched in memoirs and in your own data set, for example, do you find that once women are in, let's say, Ottawa, that they find that some aspects of politics are more collaborative than other aspects of politics? So I'm thinking, for example, of the difference between question period, which is adversarial, heckling, versus committee meetings, which can be more collaborative in nature. Just from what you've read and researched, do women politicians find that beyond the sound bites and beyond what the public sees, that Ottawa perhaps can actually be a collaborative and women-friendly place?
Yeah, so the existing work on this suggests that women are more collaborative than their male counterparts. when they are in politics. They are more attentive to their constituents' issues, for example. We also find examples where constituents are more likely to contact their women MPs in multi-districts where there's a man and a woman, for example, and ask them to represent them or put their issues forward compared to a man. So voters do see them as working more towards representing their interests, and women seem to have a good experience in the sense that they they're more likely to be more collaborative and less debative and combative in committees, for example. So those are positive experiences that women have. It might also be seen as a double-edged sword if we think that constituents are asking women to do more than their man legislator in those multi-districts where there is a woman and a man representing them.
We have another viewer question that's come in. This viewer asks, in recent years, we've seen a rise in women's political activism, including movements such as #MeToo and the Women's March. How have these movements impacted women's representation and participation in politics? And what role do you think they will play in shaping the future of women in politics?
Surely we've seen women find creative ways to get involved that don't necessarily mean running for office. So those are positive implications, and I just hope that we can encourage more women to also run for office. And one way to do that is by showing them the types of policy implications that would go missing if they were not at the table, that affect them personally and much more deeply than it would otherwise.
You mentioned some of those policies earlier in our conversation. For example, when we were talking about Trudeau's gender balanced cabinet, and you said, I asked whether or not you thought it made a difference, and you said you didn't think it was a coincidence that childcare, for example, is on the agenda. What other types of women's issues, if you want to call them that, or let's say issues, but that are also of particular concern to women, need more attention currently besides childcare?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I'm thinking about is recently, for example, we've seen Melanie Joly in the news a lot, talking about IVFs and the lack of having a national program in Canada. Although it affects 1 in 6 Canadian families, and this is a issue that I think affects women much more deeply than it does anyone else. So that's an important issue, and we hear a lot. We hear it a lot. We also heard a lot more recently when we see that women politicians are pregnant during their term, or if they're giving if they're going into labor during that time, the time off that they get from work. All of these affect women much more closely than they do their male counterparts. So having them at the table when these issues are discussed, or having the opportunity to push these issues in Parliament, are very important. But when we look at the literature, for example, we also see that men and women politicians prioritize different issues. We see that on more occasions than not, women MPs are more likely to talk about issues such as healthcare, the environment, issues that have to do with taking care of the elderly, and education. These are issues that women seem to talk more about, and they care more about than their men counterparts. So there are issues that women do prioritize differently, and it's important to have their voice heard.
Our next viewer question asks, can you suggest how women can get started in politics if there's no one inviting them to run?
It's an important question. I do think that we need to look at recruitment. So there are women who are highly ambitious and do run, even if they're not asked to run, right? But this is at the minority, and this is true for men as well. Men run even if they are not asked to run. But more often than not, we see that candidates emerge when they're asked to run, whether that's through a party official, a leader, family members. friends. That encouragement is important, and it's much more important in the case of women than it is for men, because we know that in the absence of that encouragement, women don't run. When they get that type of encouragement, they're more likely to say that they want to put their name forward in the ballot. So it's hard for me to pinpoint an alternative of saying that, another way that they can get involved, but highly ambitious women will run regardless. But in a democracy like Canada, where we have diverse individuals, we want diverse voices to be represented. So we want the voices that end up being in Parliament to represent the population that Parliament wants to represent or capture that representation. So we should have women of all walks of life, because not all women are the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Our next viewer question asks, did you notice differences in data for women running, including the way women lead or issues they prioritize at the different level of government, federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal? And they also asked, did you find any rural or urban divide in the data?
It's a great question. I don't look at urban and rural divide, although this is something that is open to do for future work, especially because since I've made the data public and looked at these studies, I've now also cleaned up the writing variables to assign them a unique ID. So this is something that can be done in future work, just replicating what is already being done and adding in the regional aspect into it. I think it's important and it should be done. With respect to the first question about, is there differences? Can you just repeat that again? Sorry.
It was, did you notice differences in data for women running, including the way women lead or issues they prioritize at the different levels of government, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal?
Great. Yeah, my work doesn't concentrate on issues that they prioritize, but other work does, and it suggests that women do prioritize different issues, such as the ones that I've mentioned: education, healthcare, the environment, compared to men who run, for example. And women politicians who do run do indicate that they ran because there was an issue that really was close to their heart. So that's perhaps also a way to answer the previous question that you asked with respect to how do you get women to run if they're not encouraged to do so. Many women who have said that they ran in those memoirs and were not encouraged to do so, say and point out to an issue that was really close to their heart that they wanted to have an impact on or change. And running for politics, being a politician, is like an incredibly unique experience in the sense that you get to help people with the day-to-day issues that they have, whether it's being able to afford to put food on the table, paying their bills, making sure that they can pay for heating, immigration documents that need to be signed, or family unifications. These are all very important issues, and politicians who do get involved, all politicians say that, it's important for them to touch the lives and make a meaningful change in an individual's life. But more often than not, women are the ones who indicate that there was an issue that they cared really deeply about, and that's what got them into politics.
Okay, I'm looking at the time, so let's take one more question. This viewer asks, you talked about the partisanship of the political scene making the environment unique for women compared to other fields like law. In less partisan political scenes, does the environment for women look similar to law and other fields?
So my work doesn't look at the municipal level, for example, where parties are absent, and therefore perhaps candidate characteristics might matter more. So having a politician or a representative being a woman might matter more in a setting where parties are absent, for example, and they're not seen as shortcuts. But overall, those elections also receive less voters who vote for them. We pay more attention to the federal elections or elections that gain more attention. And in those elections, parties are the most salient factors. They come before gender, and it matters who the party is. And so if you have the same party affiliation, as a candidate, even if you don't like the candidate, or if you're a sexist, for instance, you're still going to end up voting for that party's candidate.
Okay, so thank you. One more, last one if possible. How has SSHRC supported and influenced the trajectory of your career? That's a great question, since this is an event in collaboration with SSHRC. So the question is, how has SSHRC supported and influenced your career trajectory?
It's definitely affected me at every stage. I think getting SSHRC first as a PhD student was a relief, but also a relief in the sense that it helped me financially, obviously, and it helped me do the research that I wanted to do and not have to worry about the finances as a PhD student. But it also is great to get external validation, to be told, maybe you're on the right direction. Continue digging and see what you can find. It's your mentors are always going to say nice things about your project and your research, but getting that external validation really gave me hope to continue going. And then as a postdoc, when I received talent, I really thought, wow, this was certainly something that I wasn't expecting, but I was really touched, delighted to get talent. And it's yet another external validation telling me that, my research is good, that I'm doing something impactful, and that I have something to say in the larger field.
Great to hear. Well, thank you for all of your questions to everyone in the audience. And thank you, Semra, for this great conversation. A reminder that Semra's article that we referred to throughout this event is available on theconversation.com. And today's interview has been recorded and will be made available on SSHRC's website in the next few weeks. So thanks again, Semra, and everyone who joined us. That's it for now. Goodbye, everyone.